talk a little bit about the role that Autodesk played
Yes,
in the 3D?
sure. So I mentioned that we had a number of, that this was a public-private partnership, the 3D capture. Is the microphone on? Can you hear me? No? As I mentioned during the talk, can you hear me now? Excellent. That this was a public-private partnership. When we started the process of 3D capturing collection items, we did that on faith. We actually had no way of presenting that data online that was in any way, shape, or form compelling. The best thing we knew how to do was to create 3D PDFs, which is not a super compelling way of creating 3D data online. And so we partnered with Autodesk, and they donated this platform to us, the 3D Explorer that I showed to you. So that was developed by Autodesk in collaboration with the Smithsonian, and they've been a phenomenal supporter of the activity and really allowed us to take this to the next level.
I also have a question for you, Günter, about the 3D project. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about some preservation actions that you might have taken with these objects, because it seems, pretty unprecedented, just the sheer complexity. So I guess I'm wondering, is the downloadable product that the users can access, is that different from what you're putting in archival storage? And if so, what are those differences?
So the data we are making available is the full resolution data. We are not holding anything back. So you can see everything that we've captured is available online. So the data products are really, really big. I mean, if you want to download that cave in Indonesia, that's like 0.5 gigabyte worth of 3D data. A very funny thing happened because of that. People were basically tweeting us saying, can you dumb that down a little bit? I've been trying to open that in Maya and I can't open it because my machine isn't powerful enough. So we actually now make half-size and quarter-size models available because they're also easier to then manipulate for 3D printing. But yeah, one of the tenets of the activity really is we want to empower people to do some of the activities that so far were the privilege of the museum themselves. And we really wanted to transfer that. And I think that also is what really struck a chord with people. They saw that openness and that really resonated, and that's also part of the reason why it got so much attention.
Thank you. Leilah, I had a question for you. With regard to facilitating encounters between individuals and these large data sets, the data sets which are themselves digital in nature, and your seemingly strong belief that the place that you wanted these encounters to take place was a traditional museum setting, as opposed to making this some sort of remote activity. Can you talk a little bit more about why this matters to you, grounding this activity in a museum setting?
Sure. I mean, I guess the simplest way to put it is just I see informal science institutions as being sort of like temples of science in a way. They're places that become, so they have a social function. They're places we go to gather, to have certain kinds of learning experiences. And so it's important, I think, just to embrace those reasons as rationales, the purposes that drive people to these places. And that's why I try to support that in place. With regard to the interpretation, another thing that maybe didn't come through terribly well when we talked, I actually think there's a huge role for interpreters. Sometimes they're called docents, or there are other names given to them as well. In these institutions, they tend to be undervalued, I think, by the general public. Most people probably had an encounter with, a creepy old guy who just wouldn't stop talking to them once at some museum. And that's not what most interpreters are like or what they do. And they can serve such an amazing purpose at taking the kernels of an experience and growing it into a true learning opportunity for visitors. And so a lot of our work, we really try to integrate these people. I talked a little bit about the iPads that we use, but those are tools for the interpreters, not for the visitors. so that they can better engage with the public and better do their job.
And I'm guessing that your specific interest is in natural history museums as opposed to science centers?
Gosh, I am content agnostic.
Other questions, please?
This is another question for Leilah. It's a question about process. I was really intrigued with this notion of visualization or artifactualization of big data. Could you talk a little bit? It seems like that's a really creative process. How you go about, is this coming out of just your head, or are there discussions? Are you working with a team of people?
This is absolutely not just coming out of my head. So, you know, the pro of being content agnostic is that I can take on any subject matter. The con of that is I know nothing about these subject areas when I start working with them. So for every project I'm involved in, there's at least one domain scientist or domain specialist who helps work with me to, you know, point out what's interesting about their area, what it is that might be intriguing to visitors, what might be curious, where the attachment points might be for novices as they get into the topics. And in terms of how we manage that process, gosh, you know, lots of conversations, lots of prototyping. So I do what's called design-based research, which is a methodology that basically it's build and test over and over again. You know, it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. We do try to bring in theory and, you know, do actual research. But, you know, effectively we try things and we see what works and what doesn't, try to understand why, and then revise. And the domain specialists are brought into that process. Oftentimes our users are brought into that process as well to help inform this.
Well, looking at, you know, the example you did with climate change, who was it that came up with the idea of looking at polar bears and then getting that translated into the activity that went on in the museum?
Well, that's actually a really interesting story. So that project was funded by a grant called, it was an NSF grant called CCEP, so it was Climate Change Education Program. And I don't believe it exists anymore. It was, you know, one of these things where the NSF issued it knowing that climate change understanding was a real problem, a real crisis for our general public, but also aware of the fact that the instant they started giving away lots of millions of dollars to people to talk about climate change, they're going to be jumped on politically by certain people whom I won't mention. So they had to toe a really interesting line. So actually the primary investigator on that grant was the Brookfield Zoo. They brought in UIC, myself, and my colleagues to help them think through this problem. And one of the first culture clashes we ran into there was a lot of zoos subscribe to what's called conservation ecology, which is a way of understanding ecology that has a really strong activist bent to it. So, you know, their mission is not just to help you understand how ecosystems are changing, but also understand your role in it as a human, how your choices affect, you know, these outcomes for these animals. And, you know, for those of us who are used to working in the pure sciences, it seems a little bit like propaganda, actually, to us. Like, well, we can't tell people what to think or believe. No, we give them facts. That's what we do. We give facts. And so the polar bear game grew out of this desire on the zoo's part to have an affective experience, because we know that affect can move people, but not have it be a propagandist experience. So we let them experience what the polar bear experiences. We're not exaggerating it. That's why we're working from the caloric data they collected from the polar bears. That's why we're working from satellite data. And then we let them think it through and make decisions for themselves for, you know, what they felt like it was for the polar bear. So it was sort of a delicate little dance, but I think we found a neat compromise.
Question for Tanya about the Animal Diversity Web. I'd like to get back to the origins of this project as something that was started here on the University of Michigan campus over 20 years ago. I know that from talking to you that this was originally conceived of as a way of engaging students directly in discovery and learning about biology. And I can easily believe from what you've said about the site that it's a very rich experience for students to work in. In addition to the work that you've put in on the site itself, have there been any formal evaluation of the ADW to sort of underscore how students have learned, or that students have learned, or what students have learned, and what have you found out?
Yeah, actually we've had two grants supporting the querying work. So both building, implementing, and evaluating the tool. So, and I hinted at that, but didn't really go into it. But in fact, what we've done is participant perception indices, because we are across so many different content areas that you can't actually evaluate through content understanding or improvement learning gains in particular content areas. But what we found is pretty strong evidence that students have a better perception of themselves as scientists after having this kind of experience. So they understand, or they feel more confident about their ability to ask and answer questions, and actually, go through the scientific process. So that's very heartening. We've also done an evaluation that involves the instructors that use it, and those results suggest that it's a relatively easy activity or kind of activity to bring into the classroom, and that they really like to see that they really appreciate the results that they see in their students as well. They see learning gains.
We've reached the point where we're going to take one last 10-minute break. We're going to have all of today's presenters up here at the front. We're going to introduce our visiting scholar for this year, Leilah Lyons, and we're going to have our final panel. So we'll see you in 10 minutes.